Okay, we're going to have a review today and those types of things, so we got to be paying attention here on what we need to know for this test and whatnot. But we're going to go back, and I want to go back to 1952 in your notes when Kennedy decided to run for the United States Senate. And I want to re-emphasize that in November of 1952, he was elected to the U.S. Senate when he defeated Republican candidate Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. to become Senator of Massachusetts. So I told you yesterday, kind of put a double circle or something around Henry Cabot Lodge Jr. because we're going to come back to him. And as I mentioned yesterday, here's a signed letter from him that was dated in 1939, believe it or not. But anyway, keep that in mind. Yes?
Should we set up a page for this?
No, we're just kind of reviewing. I'll tell you the new page, okay? And we mentioned that in 1953, John Kennedy and Jackie Bouvier were married. They had 4 children, a stillborn daughter, Caroline, John Jr., and Patrick. Both the stillborn daughter, obviously, and Patrick did not survive, and so they really had 4 children, but survived 2. Of those 2, only one has survived now. Caroline, John Jr. was killed in a plane accident a few years ago, and that's kind of another story we'll get to. We mentioned that JFK's political career came to an abrupt halt in 1954 because he began experiencing severe back pain. And I want to read a little excerpt from a book here in a minute on that. I went through that, so I'm just going to read out of this book. This is a great book if you're interested. You'll probably become more interested in this maybe if we get into class longer. But this is a book called If Kennedy Lived. And it talks about scenarios if the president would have survived assassination or not been assassinated. But I want to read from this book, so I just want your complete attention. I tell you, I got to tell you a story. I'm going to fess up front. As hard as this might believe, when I was young, I was very shy, true story, and I did not read very well. I had to go to remedial reading. And it still bothers me today sometimes to read out loud, believe that or not. But so I'm going to read this to you, so if I screw up, don't start laughing, hurt my feelings. Okay? This comes from the book If Kennedy Had Lived by Jeff Greenfield. It's kind of a summary of his life, and then it talks about what things would have been like if he would have lived. What would Vietnam would have been? What would it have been like if he'd have lived? What would civil rights would have been like if he had lived? You know, things like that. It says, but it was in 1954 that he faced his gravest threat to his future, political and otherwise. His doctors told him bluntly that without a spinal fusion operation, it was very likely that he'd be unable to walk in a year or 2. Because of his susceptibility to infection, the operation could prove, well, fatal. Don't do it, his father advised. Look at Roosevelt, won 4 terms from a wheelchair. Jack was adamant. I'd rather die than live that way, he said. And from a bluntly political view, it was hard to imagine how a prospective president, whose root message was youth, energy, vigor, and future, could succeed campaigning from a wheelchair, or for that matter, on crutches. So on October 21st, he underwent a 3-hour operation in which the surgical team embedded metal screws into his spine. As feared, he developed infections. Once again, he was given the last rites of the church. It took 9 months of further surgery and recovery before he was able to return to the Senate. In the 9 years since, with the help of a compliant series of doctors and a determination to dissemble, he had been able to hide the truth of his ill health from the press and the public. His campaign team denied that he had classic Addison's disease. When he tapped the services of Dr. Max Jacobson, widely known as Dr. Feelgood, for the amphetamines he supplied, the doctor was kept off his list of appointments. I don't care if it's horse piss, he said to Brother Bob, who expressed concern about the medication. It works. Now you got to remember that Bobby Kennedy was always looking after his brother's best interest, and he got in the middle of a few other things when the president would stray away from fidelity and his wife. Bobby would always try to get him back on track, sometimes to no avail, but he was always trying to lead his brother in the right way. And now, thanks to the insistence of Admiral George Berkeley, who you'll hear about, the president's personal physician, a regimen of exercise and relaxation had provided a decent measure of relief, although he spent literally every day of his life in considerable pain. But what if that 1954 operation hadn't worked? Suppose he hadn't survived or had been forced into retirement. It wasn't just his career that would have ended. Yes, his father would have looked to Bobby or Teddy to step in, but that would have been impossible. In the fall of 1954, at the time of the operation, Bobby would have been 28 years old, thus constitutionally ineligible for a Senate seat. Teddy would have been 22, not even old enough for a seat in the House. And without a brother in the White House to smooth the way to political success, as he later did for Teddy in 1962, neither Bobby's thin accomplishments nor his abrasive personality would have been enough, even with Dad's money, to make a political run of any kind, is what they're saying. The operation had been a coin flip. Had it landed the other way, there would not only have been no President Kennedy, there would have been no Kennedy dynasty at all, and he would have not found himself in October of 1960 in a fight for the White House he was by no means certain to win. So what they're saying is, if he would have not survived that surgery, or it would have made him unable to run for politics, the Kennedy dynasty would have never occurred in America, because Bobby was too young even to run for a Senate seat. Ted was too young to run for the House. Neither one would have gotten to the presidency like John Kennedy should have. So just, it's little things in history that make a difference, and we certainly wouldn't have this class if John Kennedy would have either not survived that surgery or would have made him unable of being in politics. Does that make, I mean, is that kind of a thing you need to understand? Okay, so we'll move on here again and finish this lecture, which isn't too long. Now, during the time that President Kennedy recovered, or excuse me, wasn't President, Senator Kennedy recovered in 1955 and 1956, because he had the surgeries in 54 and 55. Well, during the time he recovered, he wrote a book. Now, this will be his second book, because Why England Slept was his first book, right? He wrote another book entitled Profiles in Courage. Here's the book right here, first edition, first printing. Now, if you look over here, this whole pile of books here are Profiles in Courage. You have the Young Readers Edition, the Memorial Edition, the Revised 50th Anniversary Edition, the Young Readers Memorial Edition. I mean, there are so many different. This was a very popular book, Profiles in Courage. And it was so popular after he wrote it that he won the Pulitzer Prize for journalism in 1957 for that book, Profiles in Courage. Won the Pulitzer Prize for journalism in 1957. What would that do for you if you won a Pulitzer Prize? Oh, excuse me. Pretty prestigious. Put him on the map, made him very famous. So he made up for those years he didn't serve in the Senate by writing a Pulitzer Prize winning book that gave him a ton of attention. Okay, and put him on the national spotlight. Anybody want to know what that book's about? Maybe not as difficult as Why England Slept. What was Profiles in Courage about?
Was it about people in the war?
Go ahead, Mary, what?
Was it about people in the war?
It was about people. You're partially correct.
It was about those 13 people, like that one guy that...
We talked about history last year, right? So these guys have a little bit of hint to it. Actually, it was about 8 courageous Americans. He wrote profiles on 8 courageous Americans. Now, if these boys could remember this, I'd be sort of impressed. But can you kind of, Mauricio, in the back of your mind, not putting you on the spot, can you remember about who one of them was?
Who it was, I remember he was
Edmund Ross, Edmund G. Ross. What did he do?
It was like, the last to decide if somebody was like gonna get kicked out or not, and then he wrote it, like what everybody thought he was.
Well, that's pretty good. That's pretty good, yeah. You remember when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated? Andrew Johnson succeeded Lincoln to the presidency. And he was a Southerner, and Northerners hated him, and so they trumped up all these charges against him, and they impeached him. Now, the only other president to be impeached was who? What? See, now, Mary has made a common mistake. Actually, Richard Nixon, a lot of people think he was impeached. He resigned before he was impeached. So who's the only other president that ever was impeached? Lately, fairly recently. He liked the women. Bill Clinton. Okay? Now, here's what happens so you kind of understand this. When a president is impeached, they're impeached by the House of Representatives. And impeachment doesn't mean you're kicked out of office. Impeachment means you've been accused of high crimes and misdemeanors unfitting of your political office. And when you get accused of something, indicted for something, then you go to trial. Now, who's the jury in an impeachment hearing? The Senate. So, if a president is impeached by the House, that means they've been accused of crimes, high crimes and misdemeanors that would result in you maybe being kicked out of office. And so they have a trial. And then the Senate is really the jury, and the Senate votes, and they have to have 2/3 majority to make the impeachment work. Okay? Bill Clinton went through an impeachment trial, and the Senate did not impeach him. Okay? They did not impeach him, but he went through the trial. Nixon was going to be impeached because of his high crimes, and some of his close friends within the Republican Party said, man, you're going to get impeached, and he chose to resign the presidency before the House impeached him. Okay? But in this case, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson took over the office of the presidency, and the Northerners didn't like him, so they made up for these trumped up charges, and he was impeached by the House, and then went to the Senate for trial. And when the trial was all over, and remember, there were many more Northerners than Southerners at that time, they started to vote, the roll call of Congress, guilty or not guilty. Well, they got all the way down to Edmund G. Ross. He was the last senator to vote on Johnson's impeachment. If he votes guilty, Johnson is impeached. If he votes not guilty, Johnson stays in office. And he's a Northerner. So what are the Northerners thinking he's going to do? Vote to impeach. Well, what Edmund G. Ross did is he voted his conscience. And here was even a worse scenario for him. The Senator Jim Lane had just been removed from office, so Edmund G. Ross just barely got into office as a senator, just starting his political career, and now it ends up he has to make this crucial vote on which way this impeachment's going to go. And he, although he's a Northerner, and the politically correct thing to do for him to save his career would have been vote guilty, he voted his conscience and voted not guilty. And his political career was over that quick. And John Kennedy was impressed by his courage, that he did that under some tough circumstances. So he was one of 8 people that was in this book, Profiles in Courage. Now this book became so popular when Kennedy was in the Senate that he was just overwhelmed with autograph requests on this book. And so this is where secretarial signatures came into history if you're an autograph collector, because who did Kennedy have sign the books? Because he couldn't possibly find the time to sign so many. His secretaries. And so they practiced like crazy. Practice and practiced and practiced to sign his name. And so when you are looking for a Kennedy signature, if that's your bag, you got to be very careful that you don't get a secretarial signature. Now they're still worth some money, but not near what a signature is worth. And I'll tell you the story, which is off the cuff, but we got time today. So many, many years ago, I am really wanting a John Kennedy signature. So I get on eBay and I see one, and it's pretty reasonably priced, so I start bidding on it. And I get an email from a guy, Harry McCormick from Sharpsburg, Georgia, who's a huge Kennedy collector. He's got a lot of stuff, incredible. And he emails me and says, do you know that you're bidding on a secretarial signature? This is many years ago. And I didn't even know what a secretarial signature was at that time. So I emailed him back, and he explained what I just explained to you. And he said, I wouldn't bid anymore because it's not authentic. So I didn't, and he and I became pretty good friends because of the common interest. And then one year, when I took the kids, when I was in a smaller school, when I had like 10 kids in the senior class, we used to go to Dallas for about 5 days, and then go to D.C. for another 5 days after that, because we wanted to see the Kennedy stuff. And I met him and his son there. We became very good friends, and he went through this whole trip with us. Make the long story short, I don't know how many years ago I could look at, but in my office I have a signed Kennedy signature. It says cordially Jack Kennedy, which is what his friends and family called him. It's a cut signature, which means it was cut out of a document. This particular signature was cut out of a document that belonged to one of Kennedy's strongest aides, David Powers. And when David Powers died, his wife sold his stuff, but she didn't want the contents of the letter disclosed, so that they just cut the signature. It's in my office. Anyway, he called me. He called my wife. He says, I know your husband's been looking for a Kennedy signature. He says, I have a cut signature that I paid $650 for that I'll sell you for just what I have in it. And my wife, who thought she was crazy to spend that kind of money 15 years ago or whatever it was on a cut signature, paid him. And it's probably worth close to $20,000 today. So a signature of JFK is very important. Now, because there was so much confusion on his signatures, they actually wrote a book to be able to tell the difference between a Kennedy signature and a secretarial signature. And Kennedy also was the first one to use what they called the auto pin, or robotic arm, in which in those days, computers could do this, if you can hardly believe that, but a lot of professional athletes use auto pins, and they just sign their name, and then the computer signs all this stuff for them. You know how you can tell an auto pin from a regular autograph? When you sign autograph, you use the same pressure all the way through the signature. Usually you're kind of light and dark. So if you look at a signature and it doesn't have any light and dark in it, it's probably an auto pin. Way off the task, but the point being is Kennedy became very, very popular because of this book. And because of his popularity, he was being mentioned as a very serious candidate for vice president in the election of 1956. And Adlai Stevenson, who we'll talk about later, was running against Dwight Eisenhower for the presidency. And Eisenhower was running for re-election. He had been elected in 52, and he was running for re-election in 56. He was very popular. So Stevenson, who actually lost him in 52, Adlai Stevenson, was going to run against him again in 56. And John Kennedy, because of his popularity, he really didn't serve any time in the Senate those years that he was recovering. But because of the book, he became a very serious political figure. So when they went to the National Convention, which we'll talk about later, Kennedy was actually mentioned seriously to be the vice presidential running mate under Stevenson. Now, he eventually lost the nomination to Estes Kefauver, who's on your ID sheet. So John Kennedy, who was seeking the vice presidential nominee for the Democratic Party in 1956, actually lost that election, one of the few elections he ever lost. It wasn't really an election, because conventions are different. But he really was the first opportunity that he lost when he lost to Estes Kefauver. He was a senator from Tennessee. So Kennedy was unsuccessful in his first big bid for the vice presidency or presidency. Now, what do you think the opinion of Joe Kennedy Jr. was on that year, when he lost that nomination to Estes Kefauver? What do you think, Carmen? What do you think Big Joe thought about that? Wasn't very happy? What do you think? I told you about Joe Kennedy. What do you think there? What do you think, Callie?
Probably thought, why are you making fun of the vice president?
That's a close answer, but to be elected to the vice presidency would give you maybe a better chance to get president, but that makes sense. So what else would Joe Kennedy think? What do you think, Allison? What would Joe Kennedy think when he found out his son lost to Estes Kefauver for that vice presidential nomination? Be mad about it? Natural answer. The fact of the matter is, John Kennedy's biggest opponent in his quest for the vice presidency was his father. His father spoke out against him in this election. That was a good guess on Callie's part, not because he thought the vice presidency was such a lower position, which makes sense to think that. Why did Joe Kennedy campaign against his son for the vice presidential nomination in 1956? Why?
He became vice president, then he could help his son get president. Was it to make him more popular?
Okay, now think about it. Why would Joe Kennedy campaign against his son to become vice president of the United States? Why would he campaign against him? And that's a great guess, but it's not because he thought the vice presidency was too low. Because really, it's a good stepping stone. If you're the vice president, you run. If Joe Biden decides to run for the Democratic Party, it'll put pressure on Hillary Clinton like you won't believe. First of all, the president's going to have to make a decision. This is not going to be good for him. But it's going to make it a lot harder for Hillary if the vice president decides to run. No doubt about it. So why would Joe Kennedy be against his son doing that? Come on, now I'd fire up. Huh? Why would he? Anybody?
He didn't like the candidate for president.
What? Who do you mean? He didn't like who?
Like the guy that.
Adlai Stevenson? He didn't. Well, Ashton, that's very close. It wasn't he didn't like him. He actually liked him a lot. But what did he know Adlai was going to do in this election? Lose. He knew that Adlai Stevenson didn't have a snowball's chance in hell to win this election. Matter of fact, it was one of the biggest landslide victories for Eisenhower in American history. And he did not want his son to be a loser. He didn't think that would help his political career. Remember, the Kennedys finished first in everything. Okay, if you're not first, you're last. He knew that Adlai Stevenson was going to lose. And he did not want his son associated with a losing ticket. He thought that would do him more damage than if he stayed out of the race and ran his own campaign win. 1960 as president. So Joe Sr. actually was thrilled to death that his son did not get the vice presidential nomination, and actually campaigned against him secretly, so he would not get it.
Wait,
Okay.
what was the guy's name that he
Adlai,
was going with?
we'll talk more about him in the next test material, but that's good up there. Adlai Stevenson. Adlai Stevenson, I have a signature of his up there too somewhere. Where is it? Where's Adlai? Here he is, right here. Nice guy, very popular Democratic politician, just a two-time loser. I mean, he lost Eisenhower in 52 and he lost Eisenhower in 56. But he will certainly come on the political scene, and you'll learn a lot about Adlai Stevenson because he's going to be really involved in the Kennedy administration later. Okay? So does anybody have any questions over this lecture that we had at all? Okay, anybody have any questions at all? Okay, what we're going to do again, as I mentioned, is Monday I'm going to give you the review when everybody's here. Okay? And then Tuesday we will meet out in the Commons area, and I'll remind you, and what I like you to do is you don't report here, you go straight out there, and you can kind of get in groups and study up a little bit, and then when I get there, I'll always give you 5 or 10 minutes to kind of get yourself studied up, and then we'll tell you to get 2 to a table facing me, we'll put everything away, give you your test, as soon as you're finished, we'll come down here, just like we do in Dr. McGee's class, okay? So I hope you've learned a little bit about the Kennedy family. What we're going to do the next part of the period, I don't know how far we can get on, but I'm going to show you a DVD on PT 109. And Fridays are a weird day. I don't even like to admit this, but I'm too old and I'm too stuck in my ways to go too awful far when kids aren't here. Anyway, so I got to find this real quick, right?